Well, let's have a look at the polls now. Joining us is guru of psephology, Professor Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. John, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Ayesha.
What are the polls looking like in terms of who? Let's start with who do you think is going to win this contest?
I think Rishi Sunak is the favourite. And for the purpose of argument, I'm going to assume that Boris Johnson does make it onto the ballot, because that's perhaps the interesting bit. I think it's pretty clear from what we've seen so far that Mr. Sunak will, if indeed it's Sunak versus Johnson, that Mr. Sunak will win the indicative vote amongst the MPs. A crucial thing will be how well he wins it, but he's probably going to win it. The question then is whether or not he can win the vote among the membership. There is no doubt that the membership is Mr. Johnson's strong point, but I think we should also bear in mind that in effect, looks very much like a rerun of the previous leadership candidate. I mean, Mr. Sunak looks as though he's likely to pick up most of the 42% that he got last time, whereas the bulk of Truss supporters would be expected to go for Boris Johnson. But let's remember that Ms. Truss did not win that election as well as people originally anticipated, and that probably Mr. Sunak was catching up as the poll closed. And while it's true that 76% of those who voted for Liz Truss, according to the one poll we've had of members that have got into the possible successors, think that Boris Johnson would be a good replacement, there evidently is a minority there who don't necessarily hold that view. So the question is whether or not, given that some Truss supporters perhaps don't necessarily endorse Boris Johnson, and perhaps because if it's very clear that MPs prefer Mr. Sunak to Mr. Johnson, maybe Mr. Sunak might be able to get over the line amongst the membership. But I have to admit straight away, you can hear me doing lots of this and maybe.
Yes,
and it's by no means guaranteed. And the other, I mean, a contest between Mr. Sunak and Ms. Mordaunt, well, I think again, Ms. Mordaunt would be primarily picking up the votes of the Trussite supporters. But of course, her disadvantage is that she's much less well known than is Boris Johnson. She has the advantage of having less in the way of form, but she also has the disadvantage of having less in the way of form. And one suspects that while she might well do perfectly credibly, and I think she certainly probably could quite reasonably argue that she has a better chance of being able to unite the Conservative Parliamentary Party, because she isn't so clearly allied to one faction or another. But even so, I suspect she probably would not be able to do well enough to defeat Mr. Sunak in current circumstances.
And John, let's pivot from the Conservative Party membership out to the public. Let's assume it is a Rishi Sunak versus Boris Johnson. Who does better with the public?
Well, again, it depends a little bit about which public. I mean, one of the features of the last leadership contest is that Mr. Sunak was the most popular candidate amongst those people who didn't vote for the Conservatives in 2019, but Liz Truss was the most popular candidate amongst those who did. And basically at the moment, Mr. Sunak is the most popular candidate amongst those who didn't vote Conservative in 2019, and Mr. Johnson is probably the more popular candidate amongst those who did. Now, here you have to decide what do you think the Conservative Party needs. Can it possibly win the next general election by reconnecting with the many voters that it has lost amongst those who voted for it in 2019? Well, maybe, but maybe equally it'd be more effective off with a fresher face in the form of Mr. Sunak. So I don't think the polling evidence, as it were, ports unambiguously in one direction. What is true, and perhaps is one thing that one could expect the Sunak campaign to point to, is once you ask people who do you think will make a good or a bad prime minister, Mr. Sunak clearly, I mean, he's only kind of got around as many people think he would do as a good job as do a bad job, but he's well ahead of his two rivals amongst the general public on that criterion. And on that criterion, you can see very clearly the division between people who voted Conservative in 2019 and those who did not. Mr. Johnson does slightly better than Mr. Sunak amongst those who voted in 2019, but much less well amongst those who didn't.
And John, in terms of and between those two men as well, just assume it is they are the final two.
Mm-hmm.
How do they fare against Keir Starmer's numbers at the moment?
The answer is that they both lose out by not dissimilar amounts. The one poll that asked this had Mr. Johnson doing slightly better than Mr. Sunak, but only of the order of 2 or 3 points. Of course, the problem the Conservative Party has is that now that it's down to 21% in the opinion polls, I repeat, 21% in the opinion polls, that any Conservative leader is almost bound to lose out to Sir Keir Starmer. And the truth is that both of them do, and they're probably on that criterion. There isn't a great deal to choose between them.
John, final question to you briefly, if you can. Where are the public on Brexit? Is this going to be an argument that Team Boris can use, that people still care about Brexit? He got Brexit done in a way.
Well, it's certainly true that one of the challenges facing the Conservative Party is that they do need, if one presumes that reconnecting with 2019 Conservative voters has to be an important part of any recovery strategy. Bear in mind that at the moment, the polls suggest the Labour Party is ahead of the Conservatives, even amongst Leave voters. The Conservatives are back down to 34% amongst Leave voters, which intriguingly is exactly the position they were at immediately before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister last time. But of course, last time that was because Brexit Party voted, people were voting for the Brexit Party on the Leave camp. Now they are voting for Labour. As for the balance of forces between them, well, YouGov yesterday asked again, in hindsight, was Brexit right or wrong? We had a record proportion saying it was wrong, 54%, a 20-point lead for wrong over right, and that gap's been widening. At the moment, the average of the last 6 polls, 56% think we should be inside the EU, 44% think we should be outside. And again, that's at a record high. So almost inevitably, perhaps, the project that above all is associated with this administration, which is getting out of Brexit, has itself now looks a wee bit less popular than it once was.